Well, thank you all for joining us today. I'm Melissa Valiant, Communications Director at Beyond Plastics. I just dropped the link to our report in the chat. We're here today to discuss a critical issue that affects our climate, our environment, our public health, and the future of our planet: the problem of plastic pollution and the deceptive concept of chemical recycling. Today, Beyond Plastics and the International Pollutants Elimination Network, also known as IPEN, released a first-of-its-kind report called Chemical Recycling, a Dangerous Deception. You'll also find this, if you didn't see the link, you'll also find it at beyondplastics.org on our homepage. We've got 3 speakers today who will be sharing findings and recommendations from the report before we open up the conversation to questions from reporters. And a heads up that we'll be recording the news conference today, but only up until the Q&A, so your questions will not be recorded. Any follow-up questions after the news conference can be directed to me. I will drop that contact information into the chat in just a moment. But we're going to start with Judith Enck. Judith is the founder and president of Beyond Plastics. Prior to this, she was appointed by President Obama to serve as EPA Regional Administrator for EPA Region 2. She previously served as Deputy Secretary for the Environment in the New York State Governor's Office. Judith is now going to provide us with an overview of the report.
Thanks so much, Melissa Valiant, and thanks to the reporters taking the time to look at this report today. I'm really pleased to join with IPEN in releasing this very important report called Chemical Recycling: A Dangerous Deception, Why Chemical Recycling Won't Solve the Plastic Pollution Problem. This is a comprehensive 159-page report. It's well documented with over almost 600 citations, and this report is published today by Beyond Plastics and IPEN. Our research shows that chemical recycling is more of a marketing and lobbying tactic by the petrochemical industry than an actual solution to the problem of plastic waste. I want to call your attention to the foreword of this report. It is written by Lou Friedman, the former Vice President for Governmental Affairs at the Society of the Plastics Industry, where he worked from 1979 to 2001. That plastics industry group is now known as Plastics Industry Association. This is a very timely report because the 3rd meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop an international plastics treaty will take place very soon, from November 13th to 19th in Nairobi, Kenya. Currently, the draft treaty does not allow for chemical recycling as a solution, which is wise. But we know that the plastics, chemical, and fossil fuel companies will be working overtime to get chemical recycling included in the treaty. And unfortunately, there is not clarity on the United States' position on this issue. As plastic production has skyrocketed over the past 5 decades, we've witnessed a parallel increase in environmental challenges. The World Economic Forum predicts that unless plastic reduction policies are put in place, plastic pollution will triple by 2060. Yes, triple. Plastic pollution in production facilities, waste incinerators, landfills are often put in low-income communities and/or communities of color, making plastics a very important environmental justice issue. And we are now seeing the same trend with the location of chemical recycling facilities. Microplastics, which are tiny little pieces of plastic, 5 millimeter or less, have been found everywhere, including the highest of mountains, the deepest parts of the ocean. Microplastics have been identified in lakes, rivers, clouds, rainfall, air that we breathe. Microplastics have also been found in our human bodies, including our blood, lungs, breast milk, and even the human placenta. The plastics industry knows that it has a big problem, and they've spent decades deceiving the public into thinking that plastic recycling is the answer. It's not, and it knows it's not. Plastics recycling in the US has been an abysmal failure. I want to emphasize we should keep recycling metal, paper, glass, cardboard, compost yard waste, and food waste. But plastics recycling has been an abysmal failure, most recently achieving only a 5 to 6% plastic recycling rate. And that's because there are just too many different plastic polymers, thousands of different chemical additives, and many different colorants that have prevented conventional plastics recycling from ever succeeding. Similar problems plague chemical recycling. The plastics industry has known all along that more than 90% of plastics are not recyclable, but they've spent millions in advertising saying just the opposite. They are finally acknowledging that plastics recycling has been a failure, and now they are pushing chemical recycling, yet another false solution that will not deal with a significant amount of plastic waste. The plastics industry has launched a lobbying and marketing campaign promoting what it calls advanced recycling. It is not advanced, and it is not recycling. Companies claim this approach can turn plastic waste into new plastic and solve the plastic pollution problem. Once again, they are wrong. This new report explains in detail the problems with chemical recycling and why it is not a viable solution to the plastic pollution problem. So what is chemical recycling, or what the industry calls advanced recycling? This refers to a set of technologies or processes that attempt to use heat, pressure, and/or solvents to break down plastic into gases, chemicals, oils, tars, or waxes. It often produces toxic substances as byproducts. It goes by many different names depending on the process and depending on the day. Most common are pyrolysis and gasification, which primarily turn plastic waste into fuel. Solvolysis uses toxic solvents at high temperature and pressure to cause chemical reactions that break plastic down into its component monomers. And then there is the plastic industry unicorn, turning old plastic into new plastic, referred to as repolymerization. The handful of US facilities in the US that are actually operating mostly turn waste plastic into climate warming fossil fuels, the last thing we need. Of the 11 facilities profiled in this report, 3 exclusively make feedstocks for new plastics. 3 exclusively make fuels, and the rest make a combination of plastic feedstocks or fuels and/or chemicals. As our report explains, there are several major problems with chemical recycling. Most notably, it does not work at scale. The other major problems are it creates new pollution, it is energy intensive, it's expensive and often relies on public subsidies, and it poses risks to environmental justice and low-income communities. Some of our findings. Our report finds that chemical recycling is nothing new. It has failed for decades. It continues to fail, and there is no evidence to suggest that it will contribute significantly to solving the plastic problem. Chemical recycling goes all the way back to the 1980s. Here's a fun example. Disney World built a pyrolysis facility to process waste and create a substitute for oil that it could use to power its operations. That plant opened in 1982. It closed shortly afterwards when Disney realized the plant was more expensive than it had anticipated because it required more gas and twice as much electricity to operate as originally planned. That was 41 years ago. Then the idea of using waste plastic to make new plastic has also been attempted for decades. For example, in 1991, Eastman Chemical Company announced its plans to produce PET plastic with recycled PET into raw material that would be blended with virgin plastic feedstock at Carolina Eastman Company. Eastman said it would produce 50 million pounds of plastic a year. This never happened. That was 32 years ago. We keep hearing that the breakthrough is just around the corner. We have been hearing this for decades, and today there are only 11 constructed facilities in the US, many of which are not operating at capacity. Even if all 11 of these facilities were operating at full capacity with no supply challenges or mechanical disruptions, they'd handle only 460,000 tons annually of plastic, or about 1.3%. 1.3% of the plastic waste generated in the US. Chemical recycling facilities are hazardous waste generators. They are a hazard to human health, particularly in environmental justice communities where they're located, which my colleague Jennifer Congdon will go into more detail about. 4 of the US chemical recycling facilities are registered with the US EPA, my former employer, as generators of hazardous waste. So why is chemical recycling touted as a solution? It's not a solution. It's a slick marketing and lobbying campaign. Why all the hype around chemical recycling? It's because there's growing public awareness about the problems with plastics. As I've said before, microplastics are in our bodies. They're damaging the ocean. They're in the very air that we breathe. So it's not a surprise that the public is expecting lawmakers to do something. There are a number of serious proposals around the country to reduce plastics, whether it's a plastic bag ban, a polystyrene ban, extended producer responsibility, EPR. All of these policies can move us closer to solving the problem by reducing the amount of plastic produced. But the plastics industry doesn't want their production or their profits reduced. They need something to say to block these important new policies. For years, they said, don't reduce plastics, recycle it. We know that was a lie. Their new line is, don't reduce plastics, chemically recycle them. But that is also not a solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. At this point, I'd like to introduce Lee Bell, a technical and policy advisor at International Pollutants Elimination Network, a leading environmental advocacy organization also known as IPEN. Lee has 30 years of experience in hazardous waste treatment technology research, including pyrolysis, gasification, and incineration processes. He's the key author of this report and will now speak to more of our findings.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Judith. I'd just like to say good morning to everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm calling in from Geneva in Switzerland, where I'm taking part in negotiations on the 5th Conference of the Parties on the Minamata Convention of Mercury. So I hope the line is good. I'd just like to say that our report produced by IPEN and by Beyond Plastics is a comprehensive review of chemical recycling of plastic waste. It looks at decades of evidence where we found that chemical recycling has never been economically or environmentally safe way to manage plastic waste, and there is no evidence to suggest that this will change anytime soon. There is no miracle technology just around the corner. In short, chemical recycling will not help to resolve the plastics crisis. This isn't our finding alone. A recent report by the Nordic Council, the official interparliamentary body of government representatives of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and the Faroe Islands, as well as Greenland, found that in the best possible case scenario, chemical recycling would only worldwide process about 3% of plastic waste projected to be generated in 2040. 3%, it's around 14 million tons. It's a drop in the ocean compared to the hundreds of millions of tons that will be produced in 2040. And further, the report questioned whether using this technology would even be worthwhile, given the massive amounts of toxic waste produced by chemical recycling and the other environmental problems associated with the technology. In our review, our report found a number of these significant problems definitely associated with chemical recycling. To summarize the key findings, we found that first, because plastics are made with toxic chemicals, particularly with toxic additives, the products and the waste that come from chemical recycling retain these chemicals. And when released, these chemicals pose threats to our health and to the environment. This is especially harmful in environmental justice communities who already bear a disproportionate burden of risk from other industrial facilities and emissions, and where chemical recycling operations are often located or planned to be located. Secondly, chemical recycling produces very few useful products while creating very large amounts of toxic waste. Plastic waste that's collected for chemical recycling will mostly come out of the processes as either hazardous waste, emissions, or contaminated oils such as pyrolysis oils that require a great deal of extra energy and cleanup to even begin to make them suitable for use in plastics production. And that means more energy use and even more hazardous waste materials produced. Instead of solving the waste problem, the plastic waste problem, chemical recycling creates a new, more toxic waste problem, and that toxic waste will usually either be burned or landfilled, taking us around in that disposal circle. Thirdly, chemical recycling contributes to climate change, and it is an energy-intensive, inefficient technology. And in fact, a US government research group found that chemical recycling can create as much as 100 times more damaging climate and environmental impacts than existing virgin plastic production, which is saying something. And finally, the vast majority of the products from chemical recycling are low-grade toxic plastic fuels. And according to international standards, turning plastic waste into fuel is not actually considered recycling. It's not classified as recycling at all. So international experts have also recently at the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste negotiations debated chemical recycling for several years, and they rejected chemical recycling as an environmentally sound management technology for plastic waste. And these are some of the world experts gathered to negotiate these issues in depth. For these reasons, our report finds that the industry hype around chemical recycling should not be considered is a dangerous deception, and chemical recycling should not be considered in plans for resolving the plastic crisis. Governments really should instead focus on solutions that promote significant reductions in plastic production and innovation using safer materials. Judith will speak a bit more to those issues after we hear from Jennifer, who speaks specifically to the US case studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Next up, we have Jennifer Congdon. Jennifer is Beyond Plastics Deputy Director and a former Assistant Secretary for the Environment in the New York State Governor's Office. She is one of the contributors to this report, particularly to our case studies of the 11 currently constructed chemical recycling facilities in the United States. Jennifer is going to share some of the highlights of those case studies with us now.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you all for joining us today. For this report, we researched each of the 11 constructed facilities in the United States that are attempting to chemically recycle plastic waste. They are not all fully operating, but they are constructed. Please see Figure 5 on page 38 of the report for a map of the facilities. Our report is generous when it says that there are 11 constructed facilities because at least 4 of the facilities are operating at a pilot or demonstration scale. These are Regenix in Oregon, Altera in Ohio, New Hope in Texas, and Prima in New Hampshire. And at least 4 of the facilities are partially or intermittently operating. These are Brightmark in Indiana, Eastman in Tennessee, Nexus in Georgia, and PureCycle in Ohio. The following 8 facilities have no publicly available data about how much feedstock they have actually processed. Altera in Ohio, Bravin in North Carolina, Eastman in Tennessee, Exxon in Texas, Fulcrum in Nevada, New Hope in Texas, Prima in New Hampshire, and Pure Cycle in Ohio. And nearly all of the facilities, 10, have no publicly available data on exactly what type and amount of product they have actually created. This includes Regenix in Oregon, Altera in Ohio, Bravin in North Carolina, Brightmark in Indiana, Eastman in Tennessee, Exxon in Texas, Fulcrum in Nevada, New Hope in Texas, Prima in New Hampshire, and Pure Cycle in Ohio. A few key themes emerged from our research of the 11 facilities. First, we found that the US facilities are handling an insignificant amount of plastic waste. As Judith mentioned, if all of the chemical recycling facilities in the United States were operating at their full capacity, they would only be capable of processing about 1.3% of plastic waste. Yet, most of the facilities are not operating at capacity. Second, many of the US facilities are struggling to create a profitable product. Examples of this include Agilix AS, which is the parent company of Regenix in Oregon, sustained operating losses of $22.4 million in 2020 and 2021. In a 2022 interview, a representative of Altera in Ohio indicated that the plant may not be turning a profit. Brightmark failed to secure public subsidies to build a facility in Macon County, Georgia, because it was unable to prove to the Macon-Bibb Industrial Development Authority that its plant in Ashley, Indiana, was successfully producing and selling a product. The Georgia project was abandoned when the public subsidies were not provided. Fulcrum in Nevada recently defaulted on environmental improvement revenue bonds, and at the direction of debt holders, Fulcrum is in accelerated payment. For both the New Hope facility in Texas and the Prima facility in New Hampshire, no records of any product can be found. And in March 2023, Pure Cycle in Ohio defaulted on its agreement with the Southern Ohio Port Authority and UMB Bank by failing to complete construction of the Ironton, Ohio project by December 2022. The default was waived with new conditions, but a recent mechanical failure caused Pure Cycle to halt production, and recognizing that the facility would not meet a key milestone as required in its default waiver, Pure Cycle filed a notice of force majeure to release itself and its bondholders from their contractual obligations. Third, we found that at least 8 of the constructed facilities have produced low-quality fossil fuels that are burned, some of it on site to power their operations. These include Regenix in Oregon, Altera in Ohio, Bravin in North Carolina, Brightmark in Indiana, Fulcrum in Nevada, Nexus in Georgia, New Hope in Texas, and Prima in New Hampshire. Fourth, we found that lack of transparency makes it difficult to determine how much chemical recycling actually costs and the amounts and types of outputs. For example, major data gaps exist for chemical recycling's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, even though many of these facilities burn fossil fuels as part of the process to run their technology. Fifth, we determined that chemical recycling is expensive and risky, yet it has attracted large public subsidies. We found that 5 of the 11 plants have secured some direct public subsidies. These are Altera in Ohio, Brightmark in Indiana, Eastman in Tennessee, Exxon in Texas, and Fulcrum in Nevada. One notable subsidy is about $100 million in federal grants and state tax abatements for Fulcrum Sierra's biofuels plant in Nevada, which very recently defaulted on $290 million in environmental improvement revenue bonds and is now in accelerated repayment at the direction of debt holders. Sixth, we found that these facilities are harmful to the environment and human health. One notable example of this is the Regenix facility in Tigard, Oregon, which produced more than 1,200 tons of hazardous waste between 2011 and 2021, according to EPA records. This means that Regenix has produced about 1 ton of hazardous waste for every 3 tons of plastic waste that it has processed. Overall, we found that 4 of the 11 facilities are registered with the US EPA as hazardous waste generators. These include Regenix, Altera, Bravin, and PureCycle. 2 of the projects, Eastman's in Tennessee and Exxon's in Texas, are embedded within larger facilities that are classified as generators of hazardous waste, large generators of hazardous waste. And finally, we found that these facilities are mostly impacting already overburdened environmental justice communities, and a further build out of this industry is a threat to environmental justice. Please see Figure 6 on page 40 of the report for a chart illustrating this point. We found that 8 of the 11 plants are located in areas with lower than average levels of income compared to the national average. These are Altera in Ohio, Bravin in North Carolina, Eastman in Tennessee, Exxon in Texas, New Hope in Texas, Nexus in Georgia, Prima in New Hampshire, and PureCycle in Ohio. And 5 of the facilities are located in communities that have higher than average concentrations of people of color than the rest of the country. These are Bravin in North Carolina, Exxon in Texas, Fulcrum in Nevada, New Hope in Texas, and Nexus in Georgia. For example, reporting by The Intercept in September 2023 found that even before the Bravin facility in North Carolina started operating, residents of a census tract within 1 mile already had higher particulate matter and ozone exposure, hazardous waste proximity, and air toxics cancer risk than over 90% of the country. In conclusion, the landscape of chemical recycling in the United States is littered with pollution and failure. Relying on chemical recycling to process plastic waste is an unreliable and polluting approach to solve the growing problem of plastic pollution. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. So what should policymakers be doing? Judith, can you please briefly share our report recommendations following these findings?
Sure. And before I do that, I really want to publicly thank Lee Bell with IPEN and my colleagues, Jennifer Congdon and Jenny Gitlitz, for this extraordinary body of work, which I think is must read, not only for policymakers, but also the people that are negotiating the International Plastics Treaty. We do not want the treaty negotiators or legislators or regulators to be distracted by the false solution of chemical recycling. The plastics industry has been working hard to weaken environmental regulations around chemical recycling, particularly in the United States. They've already successfully passed 24 new state laws to classify these polluting facilities as manufacturing rather than waste disposal. So these facilities will be subject to less regulation and therefore will be more likely to secure public subsidies. But chemical recycling is a threat to our health, especially low-income communities and communities of color, already disproportionately impacted by plastics and toxic pollution. In light of our findings, we recommend a series of actions that should be taken at the federal and state level to address chemical recycling, and they are detailed in the report. The Biden administration should declare a national moratorium on new chemical recycling facilities. President Biden should direct the Environmental Protection Agency to do these 3 things. First, require extensive analysis and testing of existing chemical recycling plants' emissions, their waste residue, and their health and safety risk, including risks for workers at these facilities. Second, the Biden administration and state agencies should deny permits for chemical recycling plants if they pose risks to public health. And third, mandate testing of chemical recycling outputs to prevent further contamination. In addition, at the state, regional, and local level, let's end all public subsidies and incentives for establishing new chemical recycling facilities, prohibit chemical recycling from being located in environmental justice communities, and for goodness sakes, given what we're facing with the climate crisis, prohibit plastic to fuel projects right away. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith, Jennifer, and Lee. And thank you for everyone's attention. We are now open to questions from the media. So I'm